Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Jay Myrex for Ultrawest.com. Thank you for joining me once again. Thank you to everybody who has left feedback on my videos, left comments, and thank you everybody that has subscribed to my YouTube channel. I appreciate the support. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please take a moment of your time right now and subscribe to the channel. All right? So today's topic, I want to talk about the difference between old music and new music and why we should not be comparing old music to new music. Last week I did a set of tests on some samplers, and after this video you should go check out the blog post I made last week. It was concerning the MPC 2000 XL versus the MPC 4000 versus Machine, and there was some really interesting results from that test. And I think it brought up a lot of questions about old versus new. And I want to try to address some of this so that everybody has a clearer perspective on the purpose of the test, and also maybe some more perspective on comparisons in general. Now, when we did the test, I didn't talk about which one I thought was better. I didn't talk about whether I thought the 2000 XL sounded better than the 4000 or Machine sounded better than all of them. In my opinion, it is very subjective, okay? When we start talking about which one is better, I think it's very important that we consider application as well, okay? We need to consider application as one of the top priorities and the top influencers on whether something is better or not. So the reason I did the test was more so to create an awareness about sound, not so much to prove that one is better than the other, okay? Because as producers and beat makers, it's important for us to understand what tools and resources we can use when we're trying to achieve certain sounds. So what better way to be able to know what sounds or what sources to go to than to create a test or comparison that shows you the differences using the same sample sources. So that way, if you know that you need a very specific sound that the 2000 XL does better, you'll go there as opposed to going to Machine and trying to recreate the sound. And even if you need to recreate the sound, you have a reference point now. So it works both ways. But to talk about which one sounds warmer, which one sounds fatter, which one sounds bigger, first of all, these are bad terms to use when we're talking about sound, because they are subjective terms, okay? What makes something warmer? Now, there are some things you can say make something warmer. You can say, oh, it's an abundance of the mid-range frequencies without being muddy and that sort of thing. But realistically, it becomes very subjective, because when we start talking about something sounding harsh versus something sounding warm, something sounding sterile versus something sounding fat, you know, these can be very subjective. I think we need to talk more scientifically and say things such as transient, distorted, saturated, dynamic. Terms like these can be quantified. These are not things that are subjective in nature. So I think we got to stay away from making these subjective comparisons of equipment and music in general. When we talk about these different pieces of equipment, we have to also understand that they come from different eras of music, okay? Well, the 2000 XL comes from an era of music that was late 90s, early 2000s, where people were still kind of transitioning. Some people were still using tape. Some people were using Pro Tools systems. But the music of that era has a very specific sound. The 4000 is kind of a midway in between, where people were more using a lot more digital recording devices at that point, and the sound is a lot more digital. And of course, the sound is going to be different from the 2000 XL. And then, of course, the Machine comes in a time where people have more so adapted fully to using a lot more software instruments and software recording devices. I think it's very important to keep in mind that there is no era of music that has not been affected by the recording options, the recording technology, and the listening medium, okay? So each era of music is going to sound different because of those factors. The 60s sound different from the 70s. The 70s definitely sounds different from the 80s. The 80s definitely sounds different from the 90s, and so forth, okay? This has to do with a lot of factors, but primarily the things that I just said, the recording technology and the listening medium are the main factors. When we were working with primarily vinyl as the listening medium, there were recording standards that were different because the dynamic range, and that's why we have to use dynamic range because it's quantifiable. The dynamic range of that medium was different from CD and other digital formats. So they had a recording standard called the RIAA Curve that dictated how to best compensate for the frequencies that the vinyl could represent. So you had a certain amount of high frequencies that the vinyl would roll off, and there was a certain amount of low frequencies that the vinyl would roll off. So engineers would compensate their recording to match or to compensate for what they would lose in the medium. Today, we do very similar things, and you have to realize that the medium has changed. Of course, we don't use vinyl anymore. We don't use cassette for the most part. I mean, some people do, but it's more of a niche thing. The majority of people are listening on things like mobile devices, Beats by Dre, earbuds, and all sorts of other type of lo-fi devices at this point. Most people are not enjoying music on hi-fi systems anymore. So a lot of the music that we're creating needs to have the new media in consideration. If most people are listening to stream content or to MPEG format content, those formats have a very specific frequency spectrum and dynamic range that they are able to express as well. So you cannot mix your record with the RIAA curves in mind if you want to optimize for digital media such as streaming or MPEG formats. You also cannot optimize your mix for a hi-fi listening environment. You have to optimize your music to be heard on things such as an iPhone or Beats by Dre or earbuds. That's the best way to serve the audience that will be listening to your music. Okay? If you're in your own world and you think, oh, well, my speakers sound better or, vinyl sound better, that's cool. You have the right to feel that way. But at the end of the day, if most of your fans or most of your consumers are going to be listening on something other than these media or medium that you just pointed out, then you have to really keep that in mind and consider that your personal preferences do not dictate how the rest of the market is going to consume the products. So when we start talking about equipment, we have to consider also that a lot of the differences in the equipment that we use are not so audible on the media that people are using now. Case in point, last week when I did the test, which you can go check out on my site, altruist.com, when I did the test last week, some people listened to it on their phone. And sure enough, there were people saying, well, I can't really hear a difference on the phone. Go figure. The phone is not really good at representing the differences so that they are apparent for a listener to be able to identify. Those differences were not subtle when listening on a hi-fi device or hi-fi listening environment, but on a phone, they were almost inaudible. You have to have a very good reference point to understand how they were different. So a lot of the difference between the MPC 4000 and the MPC 2000 XL machine are not relevant to an iPhone or even an iPad. You need to look at the equipment choices and the software choices that you make with reference to the application. That's why the application is important. So I think it's very important that you don't get caught up in some of these minute details without also respecting the format and the end result and where the end result is going to be consumed. So let's keep that in mind as producers, as sound engineers as well. When you're making the music, you have to consider who's going to be consuming it. It's not a good thing to try to compare old music versus new music, because it's always going to be different based upon the media and the technology that was used in that era, okay? Keep that in mind as you work. If you want to sound like a specific era, it's good to use the tools of that era so that you can accurately express the sound of that era. But if you're going for something more modern, then you should look to use more modern tools as well. Okay, if a lot of the sound that you are used to or that you think is competitive is coming from Fruity Loops, might be a good idea to get Fruity Loops or FL Studio. You know, it's a good idea to use what is relevant to the current era of music, and also understand how to get the best qualities out of those particular tools. So it's one thing to have the tools, but it's also another thing to know how to best manipulate those tools to get the best sound. All right. So that's why we do these tests. We do these comparison tests to understand what the qualities are for each piece of equipment or software, and understand where it's lacking, where it's strong, and how to best utilize that to get the best out of our productions. So I think it's a great idea to make these comparisons, but it's a great idea to also keep in mind that you shouldn't compare it in a subjective manner. It should be in a very objective manner so that you can understand when it's appropriate to use certain equipment or certain software. All right? Hopefully that explains the reason for the test, and hopefully that gives you some more perspective of why you should even consider different equipment in the first place. Because, you know, some people don't think that they need to know about different equipment. And I think as you grow as a musician and a producer, you'll want to explore different sounds from different eras. You'll want to try to manipulate things and, you know, incorporate different tones and technology. So it's a very good thing to know what's available to you so that you can always go to the best possible tool when you're working in the studio. All right, so hopefully that helps. If you haven't already got the first chapter of my ebook, The Sound Mind, go to ultrawest.com right now. I'll leave a link to the first chapter of The Sound Mind in the video description. Go ahead and get the first chapter. And if you already got the first chapter and you're still sleeping, get the book already. You already read the first chapter. You know what time it is. Get the book. It will bless you. All right? So until next time, I just want to tell y'all peace and God bless.